Adam Saltsman is a gifted game designer. He's someone who has worked on a number of great games, including Canabalt, one of his most famous titles, which really was a kind of genre-defining creation. Really kind of rare to be able to make a game that has such a big impact. The sort of one-button runner kind of emerged really out of heavily influenced by that game. He's also someone who has made game tools. Flixel is a game creation tool that Adam made. He's a tireless collaborator, working with a number of other people on a bunch of different amazing projects, games like Hundreds and other amazing titles. And he's the director of a game studio called Finji, which is working on all kinds of cool stuff, including the mysterious and fascinating game called Overland. Right? Is that the title? Yeah. I'm excited to see that as it emerges. And he's also an amazing person. He's kind. He is kind of a social super collider, a person who works to bind scenes together. He's incredibly thoughtful and generous with his time as a fellow designer, as someone to give feedback and work with. He has donated his time to help us out with the NYU Game Center incubator as one of the people on the advisory board. And so I'm really excited to hear him talk about this topic, which is about how to be a successful game designer, making a career and earning a living while still maintaining your principles and hanging on to your vision. I can't think of anyone better to address that topic because I think Adam really kind of embodies what it means, like the place where being a good game designer and being a good person overlap. I really think that that's what he's all about, and I'm really proud to have him talk here. So please join me in welcoming Adam Saltsman.
All right, I hope your guys' hopes aren't too high here. And I get to skip a slide now, so that's good. So yeah, I want to talk about this, which is also sort of this. This is sort of like a little more confrontational way of stating it. This is sort of what we're going to be talking about also. And then this is another way of putting it. It's in reverse. This is the slide that I can completely skip. So I want to get something out of the way before we dive into this. So I'm going to be talking about making commercial games. There's a lot of making of games that has nothing to do with commercial games. There's just making games for yourself. There's just making games for fun. And there's also a whole lot of ways to get paid to make games that are outside of what I'm going to be talking about today too. So there's getting a day job, getting government grants, setting up a Patreon, doing a Kickstarter for your project, doing contract work, which is something that I do a lot of. These are all great ways to pay the bills while you work on games that you are passionate about, which is what we're talking about, but those things are all not what I'm talking about today. What I want to talk about is actually making games in the game industry and trying to sell those games and make enough money from selling those games that you can make more games. This is sort of the dream. I've been barely managing to do this for like 7 or 8 years. It's totally the dream. And so that previous list of things you can do, contracting, Kickstarters, Patreon, etc., those things are all really useful as sort of insurance against kind of an unpredictable commercial game market, which to me kind of raises this question of, well, why bother doing the commercial game thing at all when you could just do those other things that are somewhat less risky in some ways? Because the game industry is super unpredictable, right? This is like Darius really appropriately kind of skewered what most kind of like successful game design talks and startup talks and tech talks in general are about, which is I didn't know what I was doing. I kept buying lottery tickets. I built a community. I've actually basically given that talk before. It was a long time ago. If anyone's there, I'm really sorry. And I don't think that the game industry actually is a lottery. I think it's a complex ecosystem that generates lottery-like results. For a lot of people, that's not something that is meaningfully different. For me, it is. And the reason that you should participate in a complex ecosystem that generates lottery-like results is it has the potential to reach this enormous group of people that can be hard to reach otherwise. We don't want to win the lottery because winning the lottery is a really stupid goal. This is my bad side. Winning the lottery is not a good goal. A good goal is bringing your art to a bigger audience. And a good ancillary goal to go along with that is to at least break even while doing that. Because then we get to do the thing where we get to make another game and sell it. It's really good. But the most important thing is that bring the game to the bigger audience part. So we're going to talk about how to win the lottery, because it's not really a lottery and we don't actually need to win it to keep doing this. This is a process that takes a lot of luck, and luck is this kind of big umbrella thing that includes like privilege and weird opportunities and a whole bunch of other things. And we need some luck, but we don't need impossible amounts of luck. Because we're not trying to win the lottery. It doesn't matter if we can buy a Tesla or not. We just need to be able to make like one more game. It takes a ton of hard work. I think most people, I think, get that now. You have to be a pretty young person lately to talk to someone and have them be like, oh, it's tighten up graphics on level 3. I don't want to talk about it for a whole bunch of reasons. One is it's just kind of like you have to put your butt in your chair and you have to do work for a long time. It's also kind of this like loaded and generalized blanket term that I kind of don't want to mess with, and we've got a whole bunch of other things to talk about today anyway. The third thing I think that's really important is planning, and that's most of what I'm going to talk about as far as how do you hedge your bets making games commercially. So planning is different from a plan. A plan is an artifact. Planning is an ongoing process. Planning does not replace luck or hard work in that formula. You can't just do the planning part. But unlike luck, we have some control over it. Unlike hard work, it's not just about like logging the hours. It's this kind of other animal. And so what are we planning? We're planning to make a commercial game. We're planning to make a commercial game so we can bring it to a bigger audience than we could reach otherwise, and maybe we'll also break even. What needs to happen for our plan to work? People need to actually buy our game. And so I have a theory about why people buy games. So I don't think people buy things because they're intrinsically good or they have some like objective high quality. I think this is a really popular idea, especially in independent games, because right now there's a surprisingly high correlation between games that a lot of people consider to be high quality and high sales. And so this idea where you just make a really good, interesting game and then you get really high sales. Correlation is not causation, right? And we don't even have time to start unpacking what a quality indie game means. Like that's a big giant ball of things, but I think people buy things based on how buyable they are, which probably sounds dumb, but this is a thing that means something, right? What does buyable actually mean? Buyable means, what are the qualities of a thing that make it okay to buy it, or make you want to buy it? Does it make you feel better? Does it address like weird subliminal fears that like advertisements have ingrained in you? Is it about like participating in the spectacle of modern society? Maybe it's about like tribalism or identity, like you need this thing to feel like you're part of a group. Maybe it looks like a thing that you've bought before, so it's familiar and it's kind of like giving you permission to buy it. Maybe there are these like specific tangible details about it that you just like and that you want to have or enjoy. Maybe it has to be like a certain size, it needs to have like certain features of convenience or whatever. So these are the things that compose like this weird generic shape of a commercial thing. And different commercial media have different sort of buyable shapes. Like movies kind of have to be like at least 80 minutes long. Like people don't buy a lot of like 11-minute long movies for whatever reason. They usually have kind of some expectations for pacing. If nothing ever happens in the whole movie, like people feel weird about buying that. They feel like they're not getting a good value or something. The sorts of things the movie can be about kind of fit into like a smaller circle. Books have a similar thing. It's frequently hard to sell a book that has 11 pages. There's a certain size of book that is sort of acceptable to people. Different genres of book have these very prescribed shapes of story and sets of events that happen and so on. This is a thing that Christopher Alexander would call like form, I think, but I still like the word shape for some reason. So I don't think people buy things because of like a quasi-objective cultural value or overall quality or whatever. They just buy them because they're buyable. They have this set of commercial features that are attractive for one reason or another. This sort of sucks for us in a lot of ways because a lot of those features are not necessarily things that as an artist you might personally value. And I think a lot of awareness building and kind of propaganda that we do as indie game developers is committed to the notion of expanding or modifying other people's notions of what is viable, what is a thing that you can or should value. But that's a really slow process, so what do we do in the meantime? If we want to reach this big audience, the only reason we're bothering to make commercial games anyway, basically, and maybe break even, then we kind of have to consider viability as like this sort of basic foundational element of making a commercial game, or planning a commercial game. So, for example, on my computer, how many people have a text file on their hard drive that's just like a ton of game ideas that you have not made and probably will never make? Okay, yeah. So, you have this big text file on your computer. It's got like a whole bunch of ideas on it. Most of the ideas on the list will take more than like 48 hours to build. You want to make some commercial games for the reasons we've outlined. But now you have this idea, oh no, I need to pick an idea that's viable in order for it to be a good idea to try and develop it commercially. Are there some like heuristics for that we could use to make like a more informed choice? And I think there are. I think these are some of them. Kind of how big is the game, how long is it, how much stuff is there to do is a factor of viable games right now. How accessible is it? Just in general, is it impossible to dig into this game? Does it take 2 hours to crack the surface? That's kind of a factor in a lot of viable games right now. How fair is the game? Does it feel like you have a fighting chance, or does it feel like the game just doesn't care that you're there? Or is the interesting stuff in the game right up where you can see it and appreciate it, or do you have to just dig forever? So if you add all those things up, right, it's a formula for a really conservative, uninteresting game in a lot of ways. But I think the good news is that we kind of have to or are supposed to break and ignore some of those rules. I think that's really important. We're going to talk more about it in a minute. Minecraft is a pretty good example of a game that maybe is not extremely accessible or extremely polished in a traditional way, but that first question of how much game is in there, it scores really well on that question, right? I think a game like Gone Home doesn't score super well on the how much game is there question, but it's very traditionally polished in a lot of ways. It's pretty accessible. There aren't complex controls. It's not a Twitch-based game. But then it also has kind of a progressive, like a politically progressive story that you don't find in a lot of games. And I think all these games kind of deviate from the formula in different ways. I don't think any of these games really adhere to all of the questions on that list. And that's my subjective opinion, right? But these are all games that I admire for taking kind of progressive or challenging ideas and presenting them to this wider audience. That's something that I think is really cool. And some games follow the rules very closely, and they're still beautiful and interesting. I think Super Meat Boy is a good example. I think XCOM is probably a good example, but I think it's also kind of easier to differentiate your work from the work of other people by breaking some of these rules. So differentiation is a thing that is very important, to the point where differentiation officially, as of like a few weeks ago, has its own counterculture, which I think is great. Differentiation is tough though, because it puts frequently the focus on differentiation, for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit, is on the presentation of the game. This puts a ton of pressure on a lot of teams who feel like they can't necessarily wade into a field that is already kind of broadly defined by a ton of differentiation and a ton of neat ideas and a ton of strange looks, and that's why you get desert golfing. It's just like, no, I'm not going to be different. I'm just going to be normal. Deal with it. But differentiation is kind of one of the reasons maybe that you went indie in the first place, right? Nobody was making the game that you wanted to make. There's a gap to be filled, or there's some wilderness to explore. And differentiation is kind of a weird, like, apparent contradiction of commercial game making as we just defined it like 3 minutes ago, right? We said it's really important to maintain this basic kind of viable, familiar shape for people. But we also now have to have like a really recognizable, unique silhouette of our project, this thing that makes it stand out from the crowd. And I think the balance for us so far has been to kind of pick and choose which of the rules on that list that you decide to break. So you follow some of the rules and kind of mostly fit in that Bible box, and then you kind of break some of the rules so that you don't look like everything else that's out there. And so that gets us to this place where we start having kind of like a list of game planning questions that we can ask ourselves when we're building a game. We can ask ourselves, does the game, I'm looking at my list of 200 ideas on my crazy text file, and now I can go through and kind of go like, well, does this game have this kind of vaguely viable shape? Does it fit into that bucket at all? And you can also ask, what is it about this game that really stands out from other games? I really want to make a Jungle Strike clone, like with the helicopter, and you go around and like shoot terrorists, and I can't. It feels insane to me to try and do that commercially. It would feel really good to work on, but I can't like plan it as a cornerstone of what we're doing as a company. The other important thing is that all the things that are going to be on this list, or most of the things on this list, are things that you need to ask before you start working on your commercial game. If you start asking these questions when your commercial game is almost done, it's probably way too late. But some other questions we can ask. One of them is about scope. It's about how big is this idea. So maybe you filtered your list of potential game ideas down to a handful that really fit that viable but different bucket. And then you start asking like, okay, well, how big is this game going to end up being? And it's really hard to tell. Like if you have a handful of random seeds, you can't always tell how big the plants are going to be when you actually put these things in the ground and see what happens. But you kind of have to try anyways. How many people do you need on your team in order to take this thing to the point you think it needs to go? How many kind of different people do you need on the team? How many different disciplines have to be represented? How much time can all those people combined actually contribute to the project before everybody runs out of money and has to go get real jobs? And there's this huge question of not just how long will it take to make the game in a form that can technically be released, but how long is it going to take to make the best version of this game? Which is not like the biggest version or the fanciest version or any of that. Like, what's the platonic ideal of the game idea that you have, and how long does it take to get there? If you have 6 months of runway to work on a commercial project, and you're looking at 2 ideas, and one of them can be pushed closer to that platonic ideal of itself in that window, you should take note of that, I think. So now we have 3 good pre-game questions we can ask, and now we get to talk a little bit less about sort of like business sanity checking and a little bit more about kind of game design stuff. So let's talk about this idea of an inverted pyramid. An inverted pyramid is in a really interesting shape because it maintains the same overall shape over time as you add these new layers, right? So if you only build little layer 1, it looks like an upside down triangle. And then if you add layer 2 on top of it, it still looks like an upside down triangle. And if you add layer 3, it still looks like an upside down triangle. It just kind of keeps getting bigger and more complex. Games that have this weird shape about their design tend to be a less risky game to develop than games that maybe have these shapes. Because you can stop, if you're doing this one, you can kind of get up to like 3 and go, oh, that took us way longer than we thought, this thing is way bigger than we thought, but at least we can stop now, and it still has the shape that we want it to have when it's done, and we can start polishing it and start getting it ready to share with other people. If you do this, you end up with weird things. It's not necessarily a bad game that you end up having, but it's not, if you stop halfway through, it's going to be a different game than you actually planned. And I think it's kind of, it ends up being hard to reach something that is shaped like that platonic ideal version of the game that you're trying to get to. So then we have 4 questions. Does it have a mostly viable shape? What makes it different from other games? Can we afford to build the best version? And is the idea this weird inverted pyramid shape? Is that how it can develop? These are a bunch of questions that we actually use at Finji before we greenlight something as a commercial project. And that meaning before we spend more than a week building something, we have to start asking these questions. So the next question doesn't sound like a game design question, and it totally is, and just don't barf when I change slides. Because the next question on the list is basically, how are you going to market your game? And this is actually a game design question. So raise your hand if you have ever told anyone that a game you worked on exists. Hopefully most people, right? Have you ever made a title screen for your game? Have you ever showed someone a screenshot of your game? Yeah, okay, so that's all marketing, right? And marketing is not a thing that you do or don't do. Marketing just is. Marketing is just a part of your game that people can see and or hear about. So here's some examples of other marketing. You can watch a video, you saw someone playing it on the bus, you're looking at the loading screen because you just put the game in the thing and it needs 10 updates. Somebody was just yelling at you about it at the bar. So if your game is an iceberg, marketing is like the 10% of the iceberg that's sticking up out of the water. We call that exposure, right? And so marketing is actually exposure design. And it's super important. It's the only way that people get into the strange world in your game in the first place. Exposure design is kind of like the idea that you can and should actually deliberately design this top part, and you should start doing it from day 1. Because this little piece, this little tiny bit of the iceberg at the top, kind of has this huge load sitting on it. It's supposed to be a gateway to the game. It's supposed to teach people about the game. It's supposed to kind of tempt people to come closer and find out more stuff. It's kind of like a restaurant menu or a wormhole or an Ark of the Covenant, right? It's the outer layer. If your game is a weird psychic playground that you're trying to share with people, marketing is the outer layer of that thing. It's the only way that people can see it. It's a fundamental part of building a commercial game, and it's a little bit weird because it's not a question that you can fully answer before you actually build the game, any more than you can write a full game design document before you actually sit down and make a game, right? Building is designing and vice versa, but exposure design is something that you should be thinking about right from the very start, especially if you're doing commercial games. And we can kind of break down a way of interrogating our exposure design to see if it's working, right? We can ask the game, does it communicate the game's viable shape? Does it differentiate itself from other games that maybe look sort of similar? Does it speak clearly to the game's intended audience? And this slide kind of looks a lot like this slide, right? Is it mostly viable? Is the game different, et cetera, et cetera? And that makes sense. The exposed part of your game should at least partially represent the concealed part of your game. So exposure design is actually really difficult to do. It's way harder than it looks, but it's really easy to test. That's what elevator pitches and game trailers and intro levels and watch somebody play your game for a minute and don't say anything and see what they do. That's what all those things are for, and they're really easy to do. If you have 5 seconds, you can see if your exposure design is working. But the thing that exposure design is not about is explaining everything that happens in the game that's interesting in 5 seconds. it's weirder. You're like trying to communicate some kind of essential experience about the game. You're not trying to break everything down for them, right? There's a reason that the list doesn't say like over-explain your whole game really fast. That's not something we're trying to do. And when you're doing exposure design, like differentiation suddenly, like we were talking about earlier, there's all this pressure, you're trying to differentiate the game and the focus is on presentation so much. It's because of this, it's because of the exposure design part of your game. You know, what'll make somebody's eyes or ears or brain stop and kind of rest for a minute before moving on? What's gonna sort of convince them to talk to their friends later about the game that they played and why they think their friends should play it? If you're looking at this, you know, and you're like, your game is like this thing. Like, what makes that thing special? Why should somebody notice it? What can you do when you're designing the little top part of that to make it actually stand out to people? Oh man, so yeah, now we're getting like a pretty good list of questions. Mostly viable shape, what makes it different? Can we afford to make the platonic ideal version of this game that we're trying to make? Does it have this kind of safer inverted pyramid shape? Have we thought about how we're going to design the exposure of the game? And I like this list too because this list kind of has like a weird pyramid shape to it where, you know, these early questions they're nuanced and you have to think about them, but they're essentially kind of like on-off switches. It's like, oh, this game nobody will play this ever. It's just way too off course right now. I'm going to hang on to it for a couple years until people have more radical ideas about what a game can be. But then the farther down you get, by the time you're getting down to thinking about how you design the exposure of your game, how you're designing the tip of your iceberg, that's like an ongoing process that starts on day one and kind of continues to the whole project. That's what planning is kind of all about. And the sixth step is a lot like step number 5 or question number 5. It's very much kind of an ongoing process thing. And it's this idea of not designing your game for all audiences. And this probably sounds like a kind of an old idea at this point, where you can't make everyone happy all the time. We all know that. We've heard a million times. We understand it cognitively, emotionally, and we get that, right? But we're making a commercial game. We're trying to make art. We're trying to take it to a big audience. We're trying to help it find a home with this huge group of people. We're trying to draw in people who maybe haven't heard of this game, but they actually would like it if they can just find out about it. And there's this pressure to start stretching the part of the iceberg that's underwater and the part of the iceberg that's above the water to be more and more welcoming to more and more people. And suddenly we're kind of doing the thing that we knew was a bad idea in the first place. And when you do this, the game starts to kind of trip over itself, right? The game is actually undermining the thing that made the game so kind of different and interesting in the first place. So this is going to be my quick example. I've been playing this game Mujo, which is by one of my favorite Japanese game design studios, which is called Oink. And there's a whole bunch of really smart stuff in this game. There's a bunch of decisions that I personally think are very questionable. The sort of systemic nugget at the core of the game is it's a match 3 game that has 3 different things that you can do on the screen. It's got pushing and popping and stacking. And most match 3 games only have one thing you can do. And so having all 3 at your disposal ends up being really strategically interesting, and they've explored it really, really well. But it's a mobile game from Japan, so it also has lightning bolts, which recharge at a rate of like 5 a day, which you use to level up power-ups that you use to do the thing, and you don't actually need them to play the game. The game's really fun and challenging if you never use that stuff, but it feels like they're trying to court kind of advanced players. Normal people who normally play a match 3 aren't really looking for a thing that has 3 different mechanics that have to overlap in this really kind of like counterintuitive way. But they're also trying to kind of like reach out to casual players and be like, well, yeah, the gameplay's too complicated, but we put in the lightning bolts thing so you can just zap the board a lot, and you send us $1, and then you can go to play the next puzzle that you're not actually playing. And it feels like it creates this kind of like internal tension in the games. Like, to support the in-app purchase stuff, a whole bunch of the core mathy, systemy, puzzle part of the game has been like co-opted and taken over, and it plugs into the in-app purchasey stuff. And those were pieces that they could have used and like funneled back into the core thing that was happening. And so you can end up with games where there's a sense of like dissonance in the game where the parts don't really kind of work together for the audience in the way that you think they should. And that Mujo game feels like that a lot to me. It feels like it's having trouble connecting with people. I'm trying to recommend it to hardcore puzzle game or board game players that I think would really appreciate the really interesting things that happen. They're like, well, I can't play it, it requires the internet. I can't play it on the train because it can't check if it has the lightning bolts for the thing. But they could fix it, I think, if it didn't have really advanced weird puzzle mechanics. It was just focusing on being a free-to-play puzzle game. I think it would probably be a stronger, better game. It would be like a tighter ball of yarn for that. If they were focusing on it just being this kind of hardcore, more cerebral puzzle game, that would probably be a tighter ball of yarn too. And I think that pushing the design in that direction, trying to think about who's playing the game and what they're trying to get out of it, and being comfortable with leaving some people behind and focusing on a specific group of people to make a stronger connection with it. And I think that seems important to me. So I'm going to start probably wrapping it up a little bit. So being part of the game industry is a small and optional part of the process of making games. You don't have to do it. If you do decide to do it, it has this weird advantage of you can reach a ton of people if you kind of get lucky and work hard and sort of approach it in the right way, or one of many right ways, I guess. Planning is also technically optional. You can just do the work really hard, get really lucky version of it. I've done it. It works sometimes. And that's okay. Nobody needs like a license or like a stamp from somebody to go make a commercial game. You don't have to do the planning step. But I'm in my 30s. I've got like 2 kids. I'm really interested in working like less than 12 hours a day for a lot of different reasons. Like this is one of those reasons, right? And I really like making games independently. I don't really need to do that all year, but there's something about it that makes me feel like a bigger, more complete person. And it's kind of important to me to do that with more stability than less, on account of the fatness and the kids and the mortgage and all of those things. So I'm really interested in this question of, can we make independent games in the game industry? Can we do it with a little bit of stability? And not do it by just making free-to-play games. And at Finji, this list is basically the set of questions. My wife and I will sit down and we'll open up my stupid giant list of terrible ideas and we'll kind of go down the list. And we'll throw stuff out if it doesn't have the right shape, if it's too similar, if it's obviously just kind of reviving a retro thing or whatever. We'll think about how much money do we have in the bank, how long can we buy food and work on this, and that's going to dramatically change the size of game that's going to pass through this filter. Does the game have this little shape where we can cut it off if we underestimated the amount of work that was necessary, and still have something that we can put on the App Store? It'll just be a slightly smaller game. It won't be a fundamentally broken game. We start talking about how are we going to design the part of this game that people can actually see so that they can make a connection with it. And who are we designing this for? Like, how are we going to kind of continue to focus the design so that it resonates really strongly with a slightly more specific audience? And so I'm going to start shutting up now, but I think that commercial game making does not have to be about a choice between taking no risks and taking all of the risks. I think there's kind of this gray area where you can sort of take managed risks. Chris Sharma takes a lot of managed risks. You can actually make deliberate decisions about where to gamble in your game design and where to break the rules. You can make decisions about why you want to do that and what you're trying to say and to whom you want to say it. And you can design the parts of your game that stick out into the marketplace, and you can give them as much love and attention as you would spend designing the parts that are under the water. And then, everything I just said is probably not as important as this last thing that I want to say, which is that you can think analytically about ecosystems and marketplaces. You can think analytically about the role that you want to play in them. You can analyze the motivations and dynamics of whole ecosystems. You can decide whether you want to actually engage with those things or subvert them however you want. This is my version of doing that. This is like the herb process that is lying under this list of questions that we have. And that's about all I have for now.
That was lovely, thank you. Please join me. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions myself, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And should we just stools? Let's do that. That was awesome. It's something that we think a lot about here at the Game Center. Our curriculum is very much focused on sort of inward-facing process of game design and development, the creative aspects of it, the technical aspects, and it's only recently that we've started to focus more on these larger issues of how does your game find an audience and get out into the world. There's something a little bit ironic about this that I think about sometimes, which is in traditional game development, AAA game development, game designers used to not have to worry so much about this because there was a marketing department, right? And typically, game designers hated the marketing department, right? Traditionally, the marketing department is who you can turn to blame for a lot of the problems that you see in games, for the sameness, for the repetition, for the copying, for the cliches. And you can say, well, it's the marketing department. I'm doing something beautiful, and they're trying to turn it into a commercial product, and in that process, they kind of. And so we hated the marketing department as part of the kind of AAA mainstream tradition, and we hated them so much that we became them. You know what I mean? Because as indie developers, as people working on small teams or by themselves, you have to be this marketing department. And I'm really conflicted about it because in some ways it's good, because it's really good to take ownership of that aspect of the game. And you could no longer kick it over the fence and say, well, I don't have to, that's someone else's fault, that's someone else's problem. No, if you worked on this thing, it is your fault, it's your problem, it's your responsibility. So that part of it is good. But there's also a part of me that is kind of, longs for that romantic ideal of someone who doesn't have to think about that aspect, who gets to jettison that part of the responsibility and think in a kind of more idealized, pure way about the work they're doing just as this creative work, And so are we better off now, or is it a compromise? Do you think things are better now or worse than they were in that old way?
I think better, but because part of it is like this probably is about half of the work that we do has to go through this filter of, oh crap, like we need to put money in the kids' college funds. We also don't want to betray our artistic sensibilities, and we have to kind of run this gauntlet. And very few ideas kind of make it through that gauntlet. And all the other ideas we just kind of make on the weekend. So like I never feel like I'm getting put in a place where I can't do weird things. I just try to keep us in a place where I don't spend like a year working on something that was definitely a bad idea after like one day. That's kind of all that is for me. But I think the thing you said about like the thing that I think has been weird, and I think it's like something that disappoints a lot of people, is that we threw off our like AAA chains, and we're like, here's the new tomorrow. Let's make more games about power fantasies and murders and upgrades and oh look, this free-to-play thing, this is great, let's just do that now. And I think it's good that we have to, that's in our lap for real now, because then we have to actually decide what to do about it. I think that's really good.
Do you think, there's a certain view of these issues, which is, we were watching a video in class the other day of Edmund McMillan, And it was beautiful because he was presenting this version of the issue, which is just so straightforward and black and white. He was just saying money is evil, business is terrible, businessmen are evil. Anything you do related to the business or commercial side of your game is inherently a corruption of what the game is about and what's beautiful about the game. And as much as you can, you should ignore all of that stuff, right? And then he goes on to make Meat Boy, and then he goes on to make Binding of Isaac.
Yeah.
You know, it's all 20 billion copies. So it's like this beautiful like version. You could have it all, right? You can just be, you know, the zinester that doesn't give that it like actively hates that stuff, you know, and then also like stumble into this kind of like successful career. And so is how much of that do you feel does resonates with you? Like how much of this is, yes, it's always a compromise, it's always trade-offs, but you know what? We're grown-ups and we're gonna make the trade-offs we need to make. Or how much of it is, I think this is another view, which is that your game becomes better when it encounters the world. It becomes better when you are forced to find an audience, and it actually becomes better when you think about the marketing and you think about what's going to appeal to other people, because that's a moment of empathy, and that's a moment in which you're like wrestling with the materials of the world and you're collaborating with the rest of the world, and the marketplace is this beautiful, you know, chaotic, creative destruction, Schumpeter, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, where do you end? Where do you fit in that spectrum?
So this is the thing we've been thinking about a lot, because we had a pretty good opportunity a year or two ago to just kind of like close up shop and do something different for a while. And we had to kind of sit down and make a real decision about we're going to keep doing this thing. We could go work at Subway, and then we could make games at night, and it would feel different. We would feel a lot less pressure.
When was this?
For a lot of, this happens like every 2 years,
okay.
basically. And it's one reason I do a lot of contract work is to like just take it like just kind of chill out a little bit, work on somebody else's thing, and if it turns out like crap, it's their fault because I worked really hard on it and they were in charge of it, and I get a little bit of breathing room. But the thing that I decided is that there's not. This is an idea-centric process. There is no global version of this process. There's no version of compromise or not compromise that applies to every idea that you have ever. There's, I made a game called Capsule a year or two ago that is relatively idiosyncratic, and there's no version, like taking that idea and trying to like sausage grind it into something mainstream breaks a bunch of stuff in it. I don't know how to get the things that matter in that game through the sausage grinder. And so it's not a commercial project for us. And the thing that we're working on right now, kind of the idea unscathed goes through this filter with no problems. I made a game for Baby Castles a few years back that tries to emphasize the enormity of civilian casualties in foreign wars by giving you carpal tunnel syndrome. Not a thing that I can like package up and like put on an iPhone, you know, and have it mean a lot to a wide audience, because it's a different kind of thing that you spend your time doing. And if I was going to try and take that and commercialize it, it would go through the sausage grinder, and what came out the other end would be unrecognizable. It might not even make it out. It would just be a total disaster. But we do have this short list of things that everything in Canabalt was exactly what I wanted it to be. And it just happens to match up. The list didn't exist then, but it matches up with the list pretty well. And I think part of Super Meat Boy working is it just happens to match up with that list really, really well. It also happens to be exactly what he wanted to make. So like for that idea, the sausage grinder is fine. It's already sausage. It's like sausage on paper. It doesn't get changed when it goes through. But if you have like this, you know, your little filet mignon thing that you're just like in love with, and you don't want to make it into hamburger, don't. Find some other way to do it.
I mean, it just reminds me. There's a moment that happened a couple of GDCs back. David Serlin, a brilliant game designer, super nice guy. I was hanging out with a friend of mine who works at Riot, the makers of League of Legends, and I introduced David Serlin, to this person, and I thought, oh, here's someone who appreciates high-level competitive games, David Sirlin. This is his passion. This is what he lives for. Here was someone who works with a company making a game which is arguably, the greatest expression of a kind of deep competitive game that people are playing at an expert level. It's fascinating, as a popular phenomenon. It's showing that this is a thriving world for esports and the kinds of things that David Sirlin loves. I think these people will get along. And David Sirlin proceeded to harangue this poor person and give them a tongue lashing and say, what you are doing is a perversion of the beauty and the true spirit of competitive games. Because League of Legends has gems in it or something that you have to, that you can't, it's not even that you have to buy them. He hasn't a problem with it. The fact is you have to grind them out, And so there are problems. I mean, you've written about contrivances in games and the sort of ethical responsibility that game designers have for being true to the spirit of the games and not putting junk between the player and the game for commercial purposes. He was kind of arguably talking about the same thing. I've heard people talk about the same thing when it comes to Magic the Gathering. Oh, it's a terrible game because so much of the design is encrusted with this weird problem of having to make money in the world and have people collect cards and buy cards. And I'm conflicted about it because, yes, I mean, these games, there are aspects of them that, from the perspective of kind of pure design, they are compromises. But if you stand back, it's like, there's another way of thinking about games like this, like deep, games that have communities built around them. They're not just personal experiences, where they don't even get good until they're played by a lot of people for a long time. And so this apparatus that they accrue, this weird problematic cruft that they need in order to be commercial, is necessary for them to be beautiful. So this ugliness is part of their being beautiful. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I guess it's not even a question. I just want to hear myself talk about this fascinating topic. but what do you think of what I think about that?
That's a good question.
Because this contrivances thing, Adam is famous for writing these Adam has written extensively about this idea of contrivances in games, and it is free to play. This is this new thing. So I don't know if you guys still wrestle with these issues or not.
The huge thing I think is that it's again like it's an idea-specific thing. Like in the puzzle game that I've been enjoying, it feels so divorced. It feels so obviously just like, oh, Japanese mobile market, and it's not even a free game. It's like the weird thing in that, like I picked that design for a lot of reasons because it did a lot of things that I think a lot of developers feel like is probably important. Like, we should have an in-app purchase store so that if people love the game, they can support us more, blah, 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 blah. But it's like shoehorned into a premium game, and it's shoehorned in a way that chews up interesting space that was there to do other interesting things with. But a game like, I don't even know if I can like pick out specific games exactly, but I think there's a thing that happens, and we've been talking about it a lot for our current project for different reasons, but Street Fighter is a great example. Street Fighter does a thing where it doesn't have characters who are better and characters who are worse for the most part. There's a handful of very small exceptions. For the most part, all the characters are about as strong, but the level of expertise and just raw guts and cleverness and study and familiarity that's required is on this big sliding scale. So there's a character who is easier to play at a high level than another character, but all the characters can be played at a high level. And so as a game designer, I tend to think of things scaling in difficulty. There's the easy level, the medium level, the hard level, and if you want to play the game on the hard version, then if you can't hack it, then a free-to-play thing would be like pay money so that you can hack it or whatever. But I like this other version of it where we don't think about it in terms of easy, medium, hard. We think about it in terms of like simple, average, complex, or whatever. And so in my head, there's a version of Street Fighter, and Sterling would have an aneurysm if I said this out loud, right? There's a version of Street Fighter where it comes with all the complex characters for free, And then if you want to play a flowchart character, you have to like pay $5 for that flowchart character, right? And that's a thing that where it feels like, I would never do that to Street Fighter, but it's like that mindset, the idea of having like a transparency to what you are, because I've, like I can talk about, like for me the problem isn't like that necessarily that someone spends $500 on a game. I have 3 Street Fighter fight sticks. I bought Street Fighter on 4 different platforms because I wasn't sure where the good scene was yet. I bought a whole Xbox just for Street Fighter.
You are a Street Fighter whale.
Yeah, pretty much. I spent like $600 on Street Fighter, but there's like a transparency to that relationship that to me feels a little bit different. And then this is the part where I'm going to just go way off the tracks into total snobbery, which is that I know what you like wanted to talk about this for, but like to me Street Fighter feels like a sport. Like there's a sense of excellence, of personal excellence that you can kind of derive from that activity, and for me that is a little bit different than charging for panacea or charging for the right to be told that you're smart when maybe you're not or whatever. But like I get that other people have like different needs. Like you should be able to pay someone $5 to tell you you're smart.
Yeah.
Like if that makes your life richer or better, that seems fine. But I feel like for me it should have that transparency. There should be a button in the game that's like pay $1 and we'll tell you you're smart. So they can do that. But maybe the fantasy of it being, obscure is more important to them or something. I don't know. Like there's a lot of personal experience that's not mine, and I'm becoming more and more wary of telling people what they're feeling and why they're feeling it. When it's their experience, they can do what they want. But I think Barry from Fireproof made a lot of good points when he said if there's 2 things going on with a lot of free-to-play games. One is most people download them, play them for like 30 seconds, and delete them right away. That's like 99% of free-to-play downloads work that way. So the argument that, well, this is what the people want, is demonstrably not true. Nobody wants it. Like 1,000 people want it, and they want it so bad. It's not totally clear why. And then the other thing that I think is problematic is if this was just what people want, there wouldn't be this like huge department at every company that does this that obsessively analyzes the funnel that they build for people to get more money out of them. There's a get more money out of everyone department, which is most of the company. And like that is inherently at odds with, well, this is just what people want. Like, you eventually get them to spend more money, but that was everyone's job. And like, I do feel weird about that. And as a game designer, I'm more interested. I would rather design a sport or a puzzle than a grocery store. And grocery store design is a thing that people have been doing for like 100 years, and people have figured out lots of good tricks for it, and you can do them in games. But I don't think. I would like transparency from developers about this stuff. Don't say, well, people love it, and they're like, no.
Right.
I mean, you designed like this really sexy store for them, and talk about that. It's not. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm running out of good words for it.
No, another aspect of running a studio and keeping it going, as opposed to being a manager at Subway, is hiring people, like building teams. And you recently wrote several things that were about some of the similar issues about the responsibility you felt to be a moral person, and in putting together a team, in seeking out more diverse members of that team. And maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that process and how it went, how you went about it, and how it turned out.
Yeah, definitely. So, I'll say a bunch of things about it. I want to preface it by saying this is not a purely philanthropic concern on my part. I read an interview with one of my game design heroes, Shinji Mikami, talking recently about how frustrated he is, he has his new studio and they're doing stuff, and he's got, and Mikami has mentored a lot of really big designers. He mentored the designer of Phoenix Wright. He mentored Hideki Kamiya, who designed Devil May Cry and then Bayonetta, which is just a masterpiece of a game, right? And he's mentored a handful of other people, and he's been over there he's been in the industry for 20 odd years now, close to 30 years, I think. And he's running his own game studio, and he has 3 people under him who are all incredible designers who he wants to put on projects. And publishers basically won't let him put them on projects. And so I think he has them doing a lot of design work in the background, but one of the reasons he has them doing design work for him right now is they're like 10 or 20 years younger than him. They have a completely different view of what they're building, and their view of what they're building is closer to the view of the people who are actually going to be playing the things that they're building at the studio. And so he wants them to take the reins. The publishers are kind of having trouble coming to terms with that because they want his name on it. And he has this wealth of experience. He's a fantastic game designer. It kind of makes sense, but I'm recognizing my own boundaries as a designer a lot lately. There are things that I really want to do. Like, I wanted this talk to be a big design talk. I wanted to get up and talk about really deep, powerful, just like game design epiphanies or whatever. And it's not really a thing that I can do. There's a boundary that I reach at some point, and I want other people's brains working on problems with me. And a lot of the people that I've been working with, our brains are basically all the same brains. We have a lot of the same ideas, we have a lot of the same influences, and it kind of shows. Like, Canabalt resonated with a lot of people, which is great, but Canabalt also looks a lot like a very normal action movie type of thing. You know, a lot of guys my age who have been in AAA, who have all the same influences, have gone indie. And there's a lot of games that get announced. I'm like, I would have made that. That's definitely a thing I would have made. And so, I mean, it felt like we needed. I was beginning to doubt that we were going to make something that was relevant in the way I wanted it to be relevant without people who had very different ideas from me contributing to the project. The Overland team right now is 2 men, 1 full-time woman and 2 part-time women. We're probably going to be hiring at least 1 more part-time woman because the game, we have a seed plant size problem, which happens sometimes. It's huge. The artists we hired for a reason, and one of our key reference points for the look and feel of Overland, which for me the key reference point would have been either Left 4 Dead or XCOM, because that's where I come from, and for her it's Edward Hopper. Not a key visual reference for a lot of apocalyptic survival sims, right? And the thing that's coming out of it is really beautiful, and it's really weird, and it's never something that I would have been capable of doing. And there's a whole process that goes with finding people who, like, I know how to reach out to people who will design a game just like I would design it. That's how I found my programmer, who I love working with. He's the co-designer on the project, and he's got a great, he helped prototype Hearthstone. He's like really, really sharp. But we have a lot of the same ideas. And so we had to start reaching out beyond that. I worked with Henry and Jenny Faber from Bento Miso and Dames Make Games, who are just amazing. They've been such a huge help. None of what we've been doing would have been possible without them. They just were giving time on Skype calls to help me unidiify, like, make me do all of the things I was doing less stupidly. And it made a huge difference. And there are things that I think we did on the GDC board this year. It involves this kind of like 3-way approach of reaching out beyond the normal community that you reach out to, because those communities are primarily dominated by white guys, basically. And it involves changing the language that you use. It involved an intentional shift in focus from demanding technical skills up front, and instead focusing on soft skills, which is the thing I thought we were doing already. Those were the things that I valued. And I don't care if you know how to do keyframes in Maya or not. You can go to a website and read the thing that tells you how to do that. I need to know if you can can you express your desire for what the psychological experience of a player should be. Can you do that in words and pictures and in a way that makes the game better? Like, that's what I really need to know. Or can you have a civil discussion about are you doing this? You need to hash this out right away if you are. If you're a person with a really strong personality, like a 4-person team project where there's going to be some lots of different ideas in the mix. We need to know about that. And so we switched to emphasizing soft skills more. And I mean, it was black and white. There were people, really intelligent people who I greatly admire who were not going to apply at all because there was some little fraction we had implied in a previous job post that you would need to be able to do this and as a technical skill. And if you didn't have that technical skill, you shouldn't even bother applying, was the implication of the language in our job post. And so we fixed it, and then way more people applied. And I think there's some risks that come with it. It's something that we have flexibility to try and see if it works. So far, it's working amazingly. It's helping Overland stay in all of these filters that we had up on the screen. It's helping it look different and sound different than other games. And it's and those changes are feeding back into the gameplay and making it actually play differently from these other games. And it's just been, I mean, that's the greedy side of it. The less greedy side is Jesus, it's 80% dudes. That's really messed up, right? We can't, that's not a sustainable model for the industry. 80% of writers aren't I mean, does anybody here read young adult novels? Yeah, 5, 6. Those are some really tentative hand raises. They're huge. They're great. They're accessible. A lot of them have interesting stories, and they're written. There's stuff that's coming out of YA that would never have been written by men ever, and they're great stories. So why not do that? YA's got this the worst example of how enrich our field or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. What's the downside? What's the possible downside to having the art form better represent the ideas of all the people who enjoy these things in the first place?
It seems to me like all of these issues, thinking about the ethical responsibility of the designer for the content of the game that they're making, the experience they're creating for the player, the work, the workplace, and the people who have access to making games, who have access to the industry, the sort of cultural and social makeup of that community, and how diverse and welcoming it is, but also all of these other issues that we're talking about seem to me to be part of a general trend in contemporary games, especially in kind of progressive games and indie games, in the more intellectual or experimental or artistically driven communities that are kind of really thriving in games, of a kind of moral turn, right? Of an increased awareness and sensitivity to issues of ethics, issues of morals. But you also see it. You see it everywhere. You see it in the content of games, the fascination with moral dilemmas, right? You see it in our response to clones, to this issue of cloning and the kind of moral dimension there. And you even see it in there are some people for whom this seems to be a conspiracy, right? The conspiracy of social concern that has got a chokehold on games, right? There's even this kind of reaction against it. But I think, by and large, to people like me, to people who are who are interested in games evolving and maturing and becoming more sophisticated, this seems like a very welcome and necessary step, right? That games are becoming a more relevant as a form of culture, less kind of isolated, less fun appliances that we plug in to get jollies out of, and more like these kind of rich, complex things that novels that novels are, that movies are, that other forms of culture are. So have you sensed this kind of increased interest in these issues, and do you feel like this is a good and positive kind of growing process that games are going through?
Yeah, I think it's a thing that's happening, and I'm like, the thing I'm happy about is that most of the way it's happening, probably with the exception of David Cage maybe, like most of the way it's happening is like wanting to find, you know, video games' own weird version of whatever that thing is, whatever this. We talk about it as like part of Finji's kind of internal dogma right now is this desire. And this is so loaded and so snobby, but we want to make games for grown-ups. And in our heads, that's a thing. That's a certain, it's not necessarily an exclusionary thing, but it's got, there's some kind of idea of respecting the intelligence of your player, and respecting the amount of time that they have, and trying to provide something, you know, like a thing we reference a lot internally is like wanting to, I don't want to be books or movies or TV or anything, but like a thing that we might be able to do is to have the same value to someone as like a really good HBO show or something. There are overlaps in the basic shape and size and like patterns of consumption behaviors that are associated with things that seem amenable to games and seem like a thing that we can do in addition to all of the other things. I think part of the idea of there being a conspiracy and a takeover, aside from people being really stupid, part of the problem is like a woefully mistaken conception that somehow games as a thing are like zero sum, like that new arrivals will displace the things that were there before. And this happens like every 2 years. It happens to be about feminism this time, which is like the least looming, least threatening possible influence on games right now. You know, a few years ago, oh, it's the death of premium games, which is a horrible term, whatever, because everything's going to be free to play now, and that's just not true. Some games are good free-to-play games, and other games are not. Before that, death of the PC, and then death of the, all of the things have died, at least once. All of them are still here, all of them are still, like, death of the PC is, like, probably the best one, because Steam is way the most monumental, influential, commercial platform for games right now, and has all of its own problems because of it. But, yeah, these things don't just, I mean, with the exception of like the Virtual Boy, which is kind of back. It's kind of a Virtual Boy.
Even that is back.
Yeah.
It's true. The Virtual Boy is back.
Yeah.
That's the Oculus.
Yeah. So like these things, like it just keeps getting bigger. We just keep taking over.
Maybe the Wonder Swan. Maybe that's the one that.
Maybe. Yeah. There's probably at least one Wonder Swan. Yeah, these things just like grow. Like we're in the middle, we have this like little speck of territorial way over in one corner, and we're surrounded by wilderness. And we can go colonize more wilderness, and it'll still be like our, you know, our weird like B-movie equivalent, like genre film, like sensationalist overdrive thing will always be there. It's not going to go away. Like, I mean, I think it's important to have a diverse team and to explore moral dilemmas in non-black and white ways in my games, and I love Bayonetta, I love Vanquish, like these are, you know, sensational overdrive games that are like the heart of this weird space that we have right now, and they're great. I don't want them to go away. I want there to be there's never going to be a Vanquish 2, but unless Overland needs to do really well, and then there's going to be a Vanquish 2. That's how we'll solve that problem. Yeah, we have so much room to grow. We have 1% of our little corner figured out. There's all of the corners left, and there's going to be room for free-to-play games that are clumsy and free-to-play games that are not clumsy. There's going to be room for esports, and there's going to be room for Sudoku, and there's going to be room for all of the things. None of them, some of them are a problem. Most of them are not a problem at all. It can't be. They're unable to assume the form of problem because they're off alone by themselves in their own wilderness.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to the audience and see if there's any questions for you. So you hang on to this mic and raise your hand if you have any questions for Adam Saltsman. Way in the back.
Hi. You touched on the importance of finding your audience. So I was wondering if you could talk more about how exactly you do that, and also kind of going along with the diversity thing, like how important is it to find an audience that's not just people like you?
Good question. So for us, figuring out who our audience is, what we think our audience is way more of an art than a science. I think there's probably a little bit of science that could be a part of that process of finding your audience. For us, it's kind of, on Hundreds, we had this really deliberate idea that this game wasn't for everybody. Not everybody wants to look at just geometry bouncing around on the screen, and not everybody likes this austere, kind of stark, graphic designy, whatever. And that's fine, but everyone else who does like it, we want to remove as many barriers as we can from allowing them to enjoy the game. And so the kind of on-ramp for Hundreds is very welcoming and very open, and there were lots of people we would get lots of people saying, I haven't played anything since Tetris, but Hundreds was great. We're like, perfect, that's exactly what we wanted to happen. But we didn't want to convince, there was dark times toward the end of Hundreds where we were like, should they just be blowfish? We can make all the circles into blowfish. And we'll call it Fish Pop. We will have sports cars so fast. That's not who we wanted to make the game for. We had this idea in mind of our audience, the idea that, and then maybe we overcompensated because then Ian Bogost wrote this thing about how it was haute couture, it was a fashion object, it was cool and exclusive. We're like, no, it's friendly, it's for the, whatever. And part of that whole process for me is, wanting to make things that appeal to people who aren't me, or aren't just me. I think almost everything I've worked on, I think it's important to find, it's not important to only make games that you love. I think it's really important to love the game that you're making, because people can feel it, they can taste it. If you don't do that, you're gonna have a problem. But then, making games for people that you don't know or you don't know well is like a very weird human thing. I don't know. It's the weirdest part of making things for me, is trying to figure out what life experience is this person bringing to this game? Does that, are we accommodating that? Are we confronting it? Are we ignoring it? What is our weird artifacts relation to a bunch of strangers? And it's a really weird design space.
Any other questions? Yes.
How much time do you think yearly do you really balance things like contract work and sort of the work that you're doing to make money and to kind of just hold on to some sort of financial stability in order to make the more creative personal works that you'd want to make?
So on average, probably over since I started doing what I'm doing quasi-independently, I would say about 50% or less than 50% of our money, the funding for our decade-long project or whatever, came from our games that we made ourselves and released. There's a lot of different reasons for that, some of which I think I'm not allowed to talk about, but I think I think going forward that the scale is going to start tipping toward things that we've built internally. I think it is also pretty natural, especially when you're kind of getting started, for the scale to be tipped really hard the other way. There's just a lot of stuff you don't know. The idea that you might scope a game really wrong, the idea that you might dramatically misunderstand what the game is and what makes it interesting, these are things that are all very easy to do, and things that we did a lot. And so we went from having day jobs, both having day jobs, to my wife having a day job so that we had health insurance, and me doing freelance work and badly, to me doing freelance work pretty well, to doing independent work only for about 2 years, to realizing that we really made some massive mistakes while doing that, and going back to contract work, and then doing some more independent stuff, and we've been kind of going back and forth. I think we're coming up on a longer drought of contract work for the first time in a few years. I just think I think it's really easy for lots of different reasons to look at independent game development as like, okay, you know, we're quitting our jobs, mortgaging everything, we're gonna work for 3 years, we're gonna put it out in the world, and then sports cars, and that totally can't happen. I just, like, my wife and I literally can't sleep at night if we don't have a backup plan for what happens when we can't get the sports cars parked.
How do you find contract work when you are doing that freelance stuff? Does Finji have a new business person?
No.
Okay.
I mean, part of it just was a long time. I did freelance artwork and game design for about 3 years before we started to have a big portfolio that we could present to people and talk to people, and we'd go around and socialize with people. And I mean, the nice thing was I have 2 things kind of in my favor. One is I just sort of like a lot of the people that we ended up working with. I personally thought they were interesting, and so spending time with them isn't a problem. And my personal taste in making games veers toward the mainstream. I like to design casual games. I think it's an interesting design challenge. Tetris looms large in my design experience as a beautiful thing that is worth unpacking over and over and seeing what you can do with it. I think that helps a lot. It means that if I have free time, I don't mind making a casual game if I'm bored, and then it can go in the portfolio, and then somebody somewhere eventually gets a hold of it and goes, oh, we're doing Doritos, and we want a copy of that game. If we do the whole breakdown of freelancing as a thing, that's like a whole other 90 minutes of ongoing stuff. It's a giant mess, but the thing that's good about it is, so commercial game releases usually look like this on your like bank account. There's this like spike that goes to the moon and back, and then it goes to 0 or close to it, and then you put your game on sale like 6 months later, and it goes to the moon again, or halfway to the moon, and then kind of goes back down to 0, and that gets really uncomfortable after a while with the kids and the doctor's appointments and the mortgage and all of those things. And so contract work doesn't go as high and tends to kind of like, you get your regular payments for just butt and chair doing the thing. And so it kind of like, it's a spiky graph still, but it's way less schizophrenic than normal commercial release stuff.
So I really love the concept. I really love the concept of the viable shape. That's just a kind of a theoretical thing to think about. And there's 2 thoughts I come up with. One is that the shape obviously changes over time, right? When Minecraft was first released, that was not a viable shape. And then that's viable shape. And when the survival horror was first released, it was not a viable shape. So this thing is kind of feeding back with consumers and people talking about it, and the shape is sort of changing. But it also makes me think that consumers or players do not like to be thought of as being people who are going to be conforming to a viable shape. And like, I'm going to do some optimization work in order to figure out what an optimal shape is so that you give me your dollars. I think that's sort of a lot of anger going around against free to play, but also just against what's going on with Gamergate. People are kind of like, why are you manipulating me into buying things that I don't necessarily want to buy?
Yeah, it's a thing that happens, and I think it's why games that tend to, a lot of the, especially smaller games, independent games, even certain AAA games, when they really connect with people, it's because they found really interesting ways to break the mold and change that shape in a meaningful way. So that it's new, which is exciting. People have usually lower expectations for things that are new, and They also approach it differently. Your brain works differently when you're sort of swimming in something that you've swum in before. If you're in a new environment, other weird parts of your brain start lighting up and looking for things. And so, to me, it makes a lot of Minecraft is an insane outlier, but at the same time, it sort of makes sense because it really does have, I don't know, 100,000 hours of gameplay or something. There's not a lot else outside of poker. I mean, it's like Minecraft is functioning in a very weird way, especially for a single player game. It's absurd amount of unplumbable depth or whatever. I forgot the other part. The consumers thing.
Kind of the feedback
Yeah.
configuration.
Yeah, I think I think that's the thing where people react to. They like things that feel genuine and that break the rules a little bit, but at the same time, I think the reason that buyable shape is there is that it provides this weird set of actual tangible exchanging money for goods and services things. There's some parts of that just probably aren't going to change that much because they're dependent on all the rest of our culture. A movie that is this long and the movie ticket costs this much, and that's this weird quantified exchange, and it's sort of hard to break out of that. And I think a game could break out of it. Gone Home sort of breaks out of it, but it also, really has to compensate on all those other, levels. And games that do follow the formula really closely, compensate in other ways. The overall level of quality is just through the roof, and people get that, I think, and people appreciate it. For me, the formula is not about so much manipulating people or thinking of your audience as a lowest common denominator. They'll only settle for X, Y, and Z. It's just the thing that you make. Ostensibly, the reason that people pay for it is because they feel like it adds value to their life in some way. And so the idea that they'll exchange money for this thing that entertains them for hours at a time, I think is great. That's a good thing. I want to be able to make that thing for people. One of my good friends, when his wife was in labor with their first child, the way that she kind of held it together was playing Canabalt in the hospital bed. That's an amazing thing to do with a game, and it was only able to do that by being on this list, by passing through this filter of things that add value to people's lives and make them happier or more satisfied or whatever. And I think those, this filter isn't so much about, for me at least, isn't about manipulating people. It's about understanding what makes, what does a wide audience value? Because if you want your art to reach that wide audience, you need to speak to those things.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. Maybe.
Sure. So, ever since I moved to New York 5 years ago as a game developer, I've thought a lot about how the location in which we are working making games affects the kinds of games we make and the sorts of businesses we have. I was wondering maybe how where your company is located has changed the way that your games have kind of happened, and whether you've ever thought about having to relocate.
We have a relocation backup plan. So one of the reasons we live in Austin is we've been living in Austin, Texas for about 10 years, and this used to be very true, and it's somewhat less true now, but it was pretty cheap. So I could screw up a lot, and we could still have a roof over our heads. That was a big deal when I was trying to figure out what I was doing and how to do it. And Austin has one of the greatest movie theaters in the world. It has not an unparalleled live music scene, but a remarkable live music scene. There's a lot of just kind of rich outdoor space. I used to go for a 10-minute bike ride from our old house and go to a sport-clipped open limestone rock climbing face and just went rock climbing 2 or 3 days a week for years. That was just a thing you could do there, and it had this huge, profound effect on me and how I think unfortunately, I stopped making action games about the time I stopped rock climbing, but if I get to go back to action games, it's going to be completely informed by rock climbing and by this changed. Rock climbing definitely made me a better Street Fighter player by a long shot, which sounds super weird to say out loud. But Austin's getting more expensive to live. We have a backup plan of, well, we can get a cottage on Lake Michigan in like this economically depressed state where we can afford square footage and a roof over our heads, and it will be this huge change, and it will probably change the kind of games that we make because we don't have most of the team for Overland is local to Austin. There are just a bunch of people there who have this really. The woman who's doing all of our sound design she's never worked on games before. She comes from doing engineering for bands and doing work on movies. And so, like, that's not going to find that in rural Michigan. Like, that's not a resource that's going to be there. And I can get it online a little bit, but it's pretty different. So, yeah, I mean, we have it in our pocket. We know where to go if Austin screws itself up or if we screw up in Austin. But, yeah.
Well, I hope if you do move from Austin, it's to New York City. Thank you so much, Adam.